Good morning, world history. This is Mr. Janosiak coming to you from my home. This week, we're going to be talking about the rise of fascism and totalitarianism, leading up to the start of World War II and dealing with the fallout from World War I. The big idea here is that after World War I, people are shell shocked. They called it the war to end all wars, and nobody could conceive that just 20 years later there would be a second world war. But the instability caused after World War One, what we're going to talk about today, that instability leads to fascist dictatorships and an unstable situation directly leading to World War II. So, one of the questions you should be asking yourself is what accounted for the rise of totalitarian states after World War I, and how did the quote unquote peace after World War I really set up a failure which created World War II? So, intro. If you are reading this on your own, I'm covering the content of chapter 23, page 333 to about 339. The world must be made safe for democracy, President Woodrow Wilson declared as the United States entered World War I in 1917. However, the Central Powers' defeat did not produce that result. Hopes for democracy were soon crushed by the disappointing peace that followed, a peace in which even some of the war's winners felt more like losers. Anger seethed on the losing side as well. Resentment was most prominent among the Germans, who suffered from the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles peace settlements. While bitterness festered, nations also struggled to rebuild war-torn economies. As a result, the peace of the 1920s was a troubled one, marked by instability within nations and between them. Unrest intensified in the 1930s as the Great Depression that began in the United States spread around the world. The hard times that followed, when added to tensions that already existed, caused people in some countries to support autocratic leaders who promised order, prosperity, and a better future. To many, the sacrifice of freedom these leaders demanded seemed a fair price to pay for the benefits they offered. Dictatorships developed in Germany, Italy, the Soviet Union, Hungary, Portugal, Poland, Romania, and elsewhere. Themes to consider. Fascism was an ideology that placed patriotism, loyalty to strong leaders, and the welfare of the state or the country above the rights and freedoms of its citizens. The political and economic disorder that resulted from World War I and the Great Depression helped communism and fascism to spread and totalitarian dictators to gain power. Under both fascism and communism, many economic activities are tightly controlled by the governments. I have a definition. I'm going to be using this term a lot, but totalitarianism is this political system or a form of government that prohibits opposition parties. So there are no competing ideas. There is one political party essentially led essentially by a dictator. It restricts individual opposition to the state. So you cannot disagree with the government or you will get yourself in trouble. It exercises an extremely high degree of control over public and private life. It is regarded as the most extreme and complete form of authoritarianism. Oh my goodness, authoritarianism. Today we're going to focus on this gentleman mostly in Italy. His name is Benito Mussolini, and we'll be focusing on fascism's rise in Italy, and we will see it spread throughout Europe. I'm back. If you heard a weird pause, it is because my cat seems to enjoy meowing in the middle of these history lessons. So we're back. Italy took a position of neutrality when World War I began. However, secret and sometimes vague offers of territory in Europe, Africa, and Asia Minor lured Italy to join the Allies against the Central Powers in 1915. The war proved highly unpopular among Italian troops, who were mostly peasants forced to fight for a cause they did not understand. Thousands of factory workers at home, compelled to work under military discipline, also opposed the war. By war's end, bread riots, strikes, and other anti-war protests required troops to restore order. In addition, the peace settlement gave Italy less territory than Italian leaders expected. Italy's small gains from the war came at a great cost. Some 600,000 Italians were killed and another 950,000 were wounded. Money the government had printed to pay for the war caused disastrous inflation. By 1920, the lira, Italy's currency, was worth only a sixth as much as before the war. Prices soared and saving lost its value as a result. Meanwhile, unemployment rose as the government canceled orders for wartime goods. Adding to the economic crisis, jobless workers had to compete with returning soldiers for whatever work was available. Strikes became widespread as unions demanded higher wages. Food shortages developed as farm workers went on strike. Other strikes paralyzed railroads and mail delivery. Massive rioting and industrial strikes plagued many of Italy's urban regions. In rural areas, peasants seized land from large landowners. Socialists and radical Catholic reformers who led much of this unrest, although the two groups opposed and distrusted each other. By the 1920s, the Socialist Party held the largest number of seats in Italy's parliament. Catholic reformers also had formed a political party called the Popular Party. Together, the two parties controlled the national government and almost half of Italy's city governments. Some socialists called for a revolution like Russia's 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. In 1921, radical socialists formed the Italian Communist Party. Many Italians were greatly alarmed by these developments. Bands of war veterans, nationalists, students, and others attacked socialist reformers, destroyed socialist newspapers and labor union offices, and broke up strikes. Wealthy landowners and industrialists who opposed socialism gave money to help these groups operate. A war veteran and former socialist named Benito Mussolini led one of these right-wing anti-socialist groups. The rise of Mussolini. After holding various jobs, including two as a school teacher, Mussolini became the editor of Italy's leading socialist newspaper in 1912. However, he resigned from this job after deciding to support Italy's entrance into World War I, and he was then expelled from the Socialist Party. Others who supported his pro-war views gave him the money to start a new paper, Il Popolo d'Italia. After he was wounded in the war, Mussolini returned to his newspaper. Claiming to speak for soldiers and workers, he used the newspaper to attack socialists as unpatriotic traitors. He suggested that a dictator was needed who could deal with Italy's social and economic problems effectively. In early 1919, Mussolini organized a new political movement. At first, his followers numbered fewer than 200. They were a mix of war veterans, former socialists, revolutionaries, and other discontented persons. Mussolini called them the Fascio di Combattimento, the fighting band. The name arose from the fascists. Bundled of birch rods bound with strips of leather that were symbols of authority in ancient Rome. They illustrated the idea of strength through unity and gave the term fascism its name. Fascism is a political philosophy or totalitarian system marked by strong central authority, and that places the nation and often a race above individual rights and freedoms. I have a picture of you of the fascist there. That is what it looks like. And you will actually see this symbol in some places in the United States. It is a symbol of power and authority that transcends just fascism and Mussolini's vision of it. Mussolini's group was based in Milan, a city in northern Italy. Similar groups arose in other cities. These groups operated independently, but they took their inspiration from the ideas, words, and actions of Benito Mussolini. Each group included action squads that patrolled their cities, attacking organizations of socialists, communists, Republicans, Catholics, and trade unionists. These armed bands soon controlled many rural areas as well. They were named the Black Shirts for their shirts that were part of their uniform. Mussolini organized his followers into a political party in 1921. Surrounded by black-shirted supporters, he inspired crowds at fascist rallies with his grand gestures and dramatic speaking style. His facts were often wrong and his attacks often misdirected, but crowds became caught up in the anger, strength, and resolve he projected. Backed by industrialists, large landowners, shopkeepers, and other members of the urban middle class, the number of fascists grew from less than 1,000 in 1920 to more than 250,000 by mid-1922. Fascists captured 35 seats in Italy's parliament in the 1921 elections and became part of the ruling coalition. Mussolini takes power. Mussolini had little respect for Italy's democratic government, which he regarded as weak and ineffective. At a rally of 40,000 party members in October 1922, he declared, "Either the government will be given to us, or we will seize it by marching on Rome." A few days later, as 25,000 black shirts marched toward Rome, Italy's prime minister prepared to call out the army to crush them. However, the king, fearing an army revolt or civil war, instead appointed Mussolini prime minister and asked him to form a government. So Mussolini has his thugs march on the capital, and the king balks and essentially gives Mussolini governmental power. For the next 18 months, Mussolini headed a coalition government, while he gradually concentrated power in his own hands. He made his black shirts into Italy's national militia. Mussolini also pushed a law through the legislature that allowed the fascists to secure a majority in parliament in 1924. When the leader of the Socialist Party declared that the elections were a fraud, he was murdered by a fascist thug with connections to Mussolini's government. The opposition parties quit parliament in protest. With the opposition gone, Mussolini began reshaping Italy into a totalitarian state. A law passed by the fascist parliament in December 1925 effectively made him a dictator, and he took the title of Il Duce, the leader. Life under fascism. Quote, "Fascism denies that the majority, by the simple fact that it is a majority, can direct human society," Mussolini declared. "It denies that numbers alone can govern by means of a periodical consultation, that is, elections. Thus, elections were abolished. Local mayors and town councils were replaced by appointed officials. Opposition parties and labor unions were dissolved, and fascist thugs killed some of their leaders. All individuals or groups are relative, only to be conceived of in their relation to the state," Mussolini wrote to explain fascism in 1932. This part of fascist philosophy meant an end to basic individual rights and freedoms. Freedom of speech and the right to assemble disappeared. The press was tightly censored, as were two new forms of media, motion pictures and radio. Slogans such as "Mussolini is always right" and "Believe, obey, fight" covered public buildings and schools. New textbooks reflecting the fascist view of the world appeared in classrooms. Parents were strongly pressured to enroll their children in fascist youth groups. Side note, one thing that totalitarians do almost always immediately is go for your children, because if you can control that generation, you can solidify your power in the future. Control was carried out by the army and police, and through a huge network of spies and secret police. Special courts were set up to try anyone who opposed fascism or Il Duce. Thousands of Italians were imprisoned or sent to live on remote islands. Many Italians, especially among the middle class, accepted these changes. Tired of strikes, riots, and other chaos, they were willing to submit to dictatorship if Mussolini could restore order and economic prosperity. I'm actually going to skip this one for now. I will touch on this. Okay. The foreign policy section, the second half of this particular slide. Mussolini was among those who felt betrayed by the Allies when they divided the German and Ottoman empires after World War I. Italy was largely denied any new territories in Africa and the Middle East. Mussolini told Italians that he would rectify this disappointment and restore Italy to the glory days of the ancient Roman Empire. He began to fulfill this pledge in 1935 by invading the East African nation of Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, the Italian army acted with great brutality. They carried out massacres and used poison gas, which horrified the rest of Europe. His aid to fascist forces in a civil war in Spain cost him even more international support. It also began to arouse opposition at home. As other European leaders turned on Mussolini, he drew closer to another fascist dictator, Germany's Adolf Hitler. In 1939, he allied Italy with Germany in a treaty called the Pact of Steel, an alliance that led to Italy's disastrous involvement in World War II. Military disaster in World War II eventually led to Mussolini's overthrow in 1943 and his death at the hands of the Italian people in 1945.